Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to briefly remind everybody of the Zoom rules. Stay muted if you would during the presentation. I hope you'll have lots of questions and that you'll post them in the chat as you go along, because that will help all of us remember them, you and all of us. And at the end of the meeting, we will either ask poll questions from there for Arjan, or and if you don't get your question answered, I'm sure he'll be happy to share his email so you could ask questions of him directly. So with that, we're going to go ahead and record this. This is a new thing we're pretty excited about, that we the state INPS has a YouTube station for putting all of the presentations on. So with that, I'm going to, I just wanted to let you know that you are going to be recorded, and if you would rather not be seen in the recording, then the best thing you can do is just to close off your video. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Arjan Meddens for a variety of reasons. First, a little background. Since 2019, the whole time in COVID, I think, he's been the assistant professor of forest ecology at the School of the Environment at Washington State University, where he focuses on forest ecosystem dynamics. He earned his PhD here at the University of Idaho in environmental science in 2012, and he came to UI from the Netherlands, where he completed both his Bachelor's of Science and his Master's of Science there at the main university there. I've greatly enjoyed and respected Arjan as a colleague. I think we first met when he was a graduate student. It seems like a long time ago, but he worked on a variety of research projects and eventually completed his PhD and became a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Idaho. In the last few years, I've also come to know Arjan as a wonderful dad to 2 kids and as a neighbor. We're delighted to have him and his chickens and his kids in our neighborhood. I asked Arjan to talk to us about refugia. Sometimes when we hear the news, we think of large burned areas as the whole thing has been destroyed. And in fact, there's lots of unburned islands that are often present, and they're really important in how the effects of those fires, especially the recovery, happens, as he'll explain, I think. So please help me welcome Arjan. And with that, Arjan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks for that really nice introduction and for the invitation. Do you hear me okay if I talk like this? Okay, good.
Yes.
So yeah, I'll talk about fire refugia, and this really has been work that I've been doing with lots of other people over the last, maybe I would say 6, 7, 8 years. So yeah, there's lots of people who've helped me along the way, including Eva, obviously, and other people like Andy Hudek and yeah, others. So just wanted to acknowledge some of those folks up front, and so we'll just get started. So today I kind of want to give you a little bit of an overview of what are fire refugia, and then I want to talk about 3 research projects that we've done over the last years, and then I want to sort of like finish off with talking a little bit about what is the importance of fire refugia and ecosystem recovery, kind of like what Penny alluded to just now as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I have some just extra few slides. We'll see how long I'll go, but yeah, we can discuss, or I can answer questions, or I can talk a bit about some extra stuff too. So okay, so before we talk about fire refugia, I kind of want to talk about, well, what are our refugia in sort of the ecological sense, and really this concept comes more from the glaciation and interglaciation periods, where maybe we had land ice, and when the land ice retreated, we had these pockets of vegetation that like really re-inhabited like land after the ice retreated. So they're sort of defined as habitats where biota retreat to, persist in, and then can potentially expand from under changing environmental conditions. So that works for, you know, glaciation, interglaciation really well. Here, this is like a little joke, but we see a few cows that found a refugia during an earthquake. So these cows are still alive, and hopefully the farmer will get them off of this cliff, and they basically have made use of a refugia this way. So we can use this concept for not only for glaciations, but for a lot of other sort of disturbances as well. So, but then a thing to keep in mind is it's really that the refugia are critical for species to survive following disturbances. And so we can then apply this concept also to fire refugia. So what are fire refugia then? So here we have a photo of like where a fire burned, and we have still some plants alive. So that you could see this as a fire refugia. So if we give a definition of fire refugia, we could say like, well, these are locations that are disturbed less frequently or less severely by a wildfire as compared to the surrounding landscape, basically. But so now if you start to think about that, well, what does that actually mean? You can really think about like these refugia as really different scales. So you might think about a refugia that is maybe a square meter that didn't burn in the forest floor, and we might have some, you know, annual plants or some snails or you know, yeah, little animals that like survive a fire. But then we can go all the way up to like sort of large landscape patches that that sort of might be unburned and might be used by like, I'm thinking about elk or deer that might use these unburned patches. So it sort of depends on, you know, what kind of animal you look at, like how these refugia might look like, these fire refugia. And then it's also important to think about, well, you know, when are these fire refugia important? So during the fire, this is maybe the most obviously one, right? Like we want to like escape the detrimental effects of the fire, the flames and the combustion. So we can think about shelter. But these, you know, these fire refugia on the landscape are also important after the fire is gone, to have like, you know, still some habitat or food resources on the landscape where animals could use that. And then if we think really about like sort of decades or maybe even hundreds of years after the fire, where these remnant patches have a little different structure. I'm thinking about old growth now. So then these patches could, you know, be useful as a seed source, but also include sort of more structure in the forest and have more biodiversity if we have those patches. So then, you know, it's actually like good for managers to know, like, you know, where are these refugia, but why would they sort of care about these fire refugia? And some are, you know, obvious, and I alluded to already, like for instance seed sources. So they can be sort of free seed sources if the patches are there and the neighboring burned area, you know, is ready for you know, seedlings to re-sprout. Then, you know, the fire refugia itself can sort of be sort of a seed source for that nearby burned area. But also erosion control, and then obviously the critical habitat. Like if there's habitat, it can really preserve important species on the landscape. And then if we then sort of kind of like are managing our forest post-fire, it might be important to know where these fire refugia are, so we can monitor them if there's no invasive species coming into the fire refugia, or even if we think about like preserving them, we might do some fuel management or some suppression around important areas that we want to sort of maintain on the landscape as fire refugia. Okay, so then there's another like sort of axis which you could think of like for fire refugia. So often when we think about these fire refugia, we think about these, you know, old growth patches that don't get burned and like get to live very long. So these are the what we would call persistent unburned areas or persistent fire refugia that like through many fires remain unburned. And so they can be really important, for instance, for the spotted owl or like really biota that are associated with old growth. But then there's this other sort of type of fire refugia, what we call like an ephemeral, that are basically shifting over the landscape. So you can imagine like sort of a grassland or a rangeland where we have fires burning through a landscape. And then, you know, like maybe 10 years later, another fire comes through. During the first fire, there might be some patches unburned. In the second fire, there might be some patches unburned, but they might not overlap necessarily. But they're still really important to have them, for instance, for like, you know, butterflies or like insects that can really be important. So this patchwork, you know, it might still be very important on these sort of grassland fires. Okay, so then if we think about fire refugia and climate change, as we all know, we have seen an increasing fire activity here in the Northwest. Or in the Western US as here depicted. You can see sort of here in the red, we see the recent fire years whereas in the blue are the fire years before that. So we're seeing an increase in fire activity and that's sort of related to fuel aridity, which then is again related to climate. So we see due to some climate change, we see more fire. So with that, we also see more shaping of these fire refugia. Now, so that's really what sort of this climate change is like, sort of shaping the size and distribution of fire refugia. But then climate change is also affecting the ecosystem recovery after the fire. So like thinking about seed sources and how forests are recovering. So really what this is meant to say is that like that climate change is both affecting, you know, how these fire refugia come to be and how they actually function in the ecosystem, and both can, you know, lead to ecosystem vulnerability if these climate conditions become detrimental. So that's sort of something to keep in mind. So now what I'll talk about now, start talking about the first research project, and this is really sort of like what sort of the basis was of the subsequent research what we've done. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But maybe first off, you see my background is like sort of in space. I'm really not so much as a native plant ecologist, but more like a remote sensor. So I look from space down and look at these fire patterns in the landscape as like sort of a whole. So I'll talk a bit about that. So here, what my objectives was to detect unburned areas, like all the unburned areas across the inland Northwest for a time period. And then we wanted to assess and see what sort of the spatial and temporal patterns were of these unburned areas. And our working hypothesis here was really like, we thought, oh, these fire refugia are disappearing because of these changing temperatures. We thought like hotter and drier spring and summers would lead to like a more severe or more complete fire effects. So we would actually see a decrease in the percentage of unburned area. So that was really our working hypothesis. Our hypothesis we thought, well, we see these unburned areas disappearing. And then we want to sort of develop these an unburned island database. So put that in a big spatial database to then assess different other ecological analysis. So basically we used the Landsat data record. So this is like a moderate resolution Landsat, and it has a pretty long record in remote sensing terms. So this is from the 80s to sort of basically the present. And so I think we analyzed it from 1984 to 2015 was sort of our record. And we used field locations of like about 850 plots, and we used a classification tree to sort of separate the burned from the unburned areas, so that we could look at these unburned areas, which we would, assume would include the fire refugia. And so I won't go into much details, but we use some spectral indices. So like basically some Landsat derived reflectance to separate what burned and what didn't burn. And so basically here you can see our study area. So it was basically east of the Cascades in Washington and Oregon, and then the state of Idaho. And so we have all these fires over here, which were over like 1,000 fires. So this is really like a large database to look at these things. And so when we applied this like classification tree over all these fires, and then we looked at basically, well, what sort of is the proportion of unburned area over time, and that's sort of this black line you can see over here, and we have the standard error bars associated with that. So when we started looking like, oh, this is the result, and what our hypothesis was really was this like the unburned area, that proportion was decreasing. That was our hypothesis, but we couldn't find a trend in this line. It's basically flat, although it bounces up and down a little bit. We couldn't really prove anything that like there is like unburned areas that are disappearing. So that's basically the good news. We couldn't find a significant trend, so we think the fire refugia are not yet disappearing, at least. So then we looked a little bit further into like, well, what are these like, years where we see a little bit more, a higher proportion of unburned area. And you can sort of see that those are associated. These are the bars in the background are like basically how big was a fire year, like how much area burned in that year. So when we see these like low fire years, we see actually a higher percentage of unburned areas. And that might make sense. Like these might be like cooler weather summers where we might not see as much fire in general. And then when it does burn, it doesn't burn as completely. So we can sort of see a little bit of a pattern in there. And so if we have these exceptionally low fire years, we also have an increased unburned proportion. So we could say like, well, if there's moist years, we might see some more unburned areas in the areas that burn. So, and if you flip that around, you could say like, if that decreases due to climate change, we might still see an effect there. But, these are still small sample sizes. So we refrain from saying like real hard conclusions on that. So that's basically that database. So now we have all this data for the inland Northwest, and for every fire, we know exactly where did it burn and where didn't it burn. So now we wanted to start looking at some of these fires and some of these unburned areas, if they really are fire refugia, right? So we don't really know yet if they're fire refugia, if we don't know what kind of species or what kind of ecosystem process is going on. So our first, obvious one is like, oh, we got to look at the sage grouse and see what the effect of these unburned patches are on sage grouse. So here, this second research project, we really wanted to look at the sage grouse populations and see what happened like after wildfires at these sage grouse populations. So we actually looked in northeastern Oregon, where we could get like statistics on like I don't know how many, it's maybe over 2,000 lek sites, where we looked at like, okay, where we had this big data set of all these lek sites, and lek sites are these sites where male sage grouse basically come back every year and sort of do their dance, and they do their mating call and all that, and so they come back to those sites, and that's what basically the wildlife ecologists use to count the population. So we had these like population counts at these lek sites in northeastern Oregon, and then we overlaid all the fires and saw like, well, where are the lek sites that actually burned. And then we also looked at like, where are the lek sites that actually were within the fire perimeter, but didn't burn. So we're actually in that unburned island. And then we wanted to look at like, well, what are these lek numbers before the fire and after the fire, and compare those. So basically, this is sort of more schematic schematic of what we were doing. Is like, so here we had sort of a hypothetical wildfire, and then we had these lek sites, like one lek site was maybe like completely burned, and then we had a lek site that was actually in an unburned island, and then we also compared that with lek sites which were just outside the perimeter. And then these were our like sort of our hypothesized like effects. So we had like a population size, like if we're outside the fire, it would be relatively stable. If it was inside the fire, but also in an unburned island, it would be like maybe a little bit of an effect of the fire, but it would remain stable. But then if it was like in a fire and it was burned, it would like sort of really significantly decrease the population. And so here, this is a study site. It's in southeastern Oregon. Maybe I misstated that. But so then when we looked at our data, so we could really show, and this is was so excited to me, that we can see that like, well, if we have a burned lek site, we can really see a significant decrease from pre to post fire in these population counts, right? So fire is kind of detrimental to these sage grouse populations. But if we're in a wildfire, but also in a unburned area, then these populations seem to be at least resilient. So to me, this was like, wow, we really showed that like sage grouse use these unburned areas as fire refugia, and this works. So that was really an exciting conclusion. The little bit less exciting part of that is that we only found 6 lek sites that were in, 9 lek sites that were in a wildfire in an unburned area. So of our 2,000 plus lek sites, there were only like 9 of those sites that were there. So small sample size, but still like a really interesting result to me. So that was our second research project. So now talking about our third research project, and this now we're taking this a little bit away from like really the ecosystem sciences, more into sort of like, how do we manage for this, and how do we think about this as a management perspective. So our idea was to like sort of come up with ways to think about like, well, we have all these unburned areas, but not all these unburned areas are fire refugia. Some you know, contain maybe invasive species, or, you know, there are just roads or a bunch of rocks. Now, rocks can also be a, you know, fire refugia in itself if you think about specialized amphibians or something like that. But so we wanted to sort of come up with a system that managers could say, okay, well, this is like the most important fire refugias we need to manage for, and the rest is maybe not as important. So so we wanted to come up with these like ways of like, how can we, you know, separate out important refugia from not so important ones. So we wanted to come up with a ranking system to sort of yeah, rank basically unburned areas within our data set. And then, you know, help managers characterize these important ones. And so initially we thought like, oh, we're going to do this for this whole data set, and we just apply one algorithm, and there we go, and we'll give that to the managers. And then we organized a couple of workshops, and we did some participatory GIS, and we quickly found that these managers had, you know, every manager had already a different idea, and then you know, we as sort of our scientists, we had different ideas, and we're like, okay, well, so one ranking system is never going to work for all this. So we had to go back to the drawing board to sort of come up with like, well, what would work for this. But basically, when we were developing it, we wanted to have it like spatially explicit, so like a sort of a GIS layer of these refugia, and we wanted to incorporate basically the geospatial data, like how big is a refugia, and, you know, how far is it from another one, and also having like sort of the expert knowledge, like having these managers sort of tell us like, well, what is important. So so we came up with some sort of framework where we could look at like, okay, we can come up with these multiple criteria that eventually sort of leads to a given refugia, a fire refugia index. And then we can look at these like fire refugia within an unburned area, like sort of the fire refugia itself. But we can also look at like, well, what is like sort of surrounding that fire refugia? Are there other refugia in the neighborhood, or is this one really by itself? And so that sort of like was our like working model over here, and we put this into sort of a special environmental evaluation modeling system, which I won't bother you too much about. But so our first idea was that, oh, we can apply this for this whole data set, but then obviously that didn't work out. So then we sort of focused on a given species, which is the spotted owl. So we sort of went through all the sort of literature of like what does spotted owl need, and what kind of like data sets are available to help us sort of sort out what is important habitat for the spotted owl. And so then we could sort of really put that into a database and overlay that all, and sort of so what you can sort of see here is sort of the application of that model, and then we end up with these patches, which you can see here, where we have like highly valued fire refugia for the spotted owl, and then here are not so highly valued, so lower valued fire refugia for the spotted owl. So this is sort of like a framework that we developed, and we applied it to the spotted owl. The score basically goes from a -1, which is low, to a +1, which is high. And we made it pretty adaptable, so we can sort of like adapt this to other species as well. So we're really like hopeful, and we've gotten some interest from the Forest Service that they actually want to write some code and get this into their like working plan. So we're pretty excited about that. Okay, so then I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about, so these were my 3 research projects. those are a little bit done now. You know, I'm starting to think about other things, and this is actually work what Penny has done too. Is looking at a recovery of post-fire landscapes and seeing what comes back after, you know, after fire. And so here you can sort of see a graph where we sort of have the probability of a seedling presence with the distance to seed source. And when I see this often, I think like, okay, here at 0, this is where we have our fire refugia, and then here we go into our burned area next to the fire refugia, right? So you can see that sort of the probability of getting a seed present away from the edge of a fire refugia sort of decreases. So if we get like large patches of burnt area without any fire refugia, we might like expect a slower recovery as compared to where we have areas that are close to fire refugia. And so to sort of maybe drive this home a little bit more, one of my colleagues, Jonathan Coop, put this into sort of a modeling framework where he really wanted to look at like, well, what does one given tree or seed source like do for the sort of recovery of an ecosystem over time. So they sort of basically modeled sort of the trees, like, you know, putting seeds down, and like how long it will take basically for this recovery to occur. And so you can sort of model that over time, and so you can basically use different distance weighted distance metrics, and then you go like you get like time plus 1, and so maybe here we're into 30 years into the future, and we can sort of see how the ecosystem is recovering. And sort of the conclusions out of this study basically were that fire refugia really strongly promote the natural forest regeneration, and that especially these small patches of trees in the burn interiors are really important for forest recovery. So that's really like an interesting finding to me, like what these really the small little patches that still bear seed that can really like have a disproportionate importance in that forest recovery. So so that with that, I have some summary and I have some extra slides. I don't know if I should just open it up for questions, or I can talk a little bit more about some extra interesting slides. If there are no immediate questions, I'll just continue finishing up with the summary slide, and then I can see and talk a little bit more maybe about some other slides that I prepared. So basically, as a summary, unburnt areas, some are fire refugia, especially if they consist of critical habitat for biota, or if they remain unburned for a longer time and, you know, contain these like important old growth structures. We didn't find any trend in the overall unburned proportion over time, but more research is needed to see if these dynamics still are the same with ongoing climate change. And then these fire refugia patches are important for research, resource management, and they can really improve the landscape resiliencies and enhance ecosystem recovery. So then maybe the few things I sort of looked at, and I didn't prepare this like a whole while, but since I'm talking to you guys as a native plant society, I looked at some of we did a review on fire refugia and we published that in 2018. And I sort of looked at some papers that really looked at like, well, what are some native plants and what did they find? So here are some examples of where they basically look at maybe species richness. And I think this is like a given tree species in South Africa. Here are maybe some brigatified taxa that they looked at within the fire refugia. So kind of interesting, like shrub cover, and also here this is a sort of a classic story of a cypress in Patagonia that is sort of like has these fire refugial sites, which is really cool. So I had like a question for maybe the group here is like, well, what can we think of some fire sensitive native plants in Idaho that could use fire refugia to survive? So I'd be interested to hear if you guys have any ideas there. And so maybe I'll
juniper, old growth pine. Well, pine can use fire too.
Well, thank you then, Arjan, for your, can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation then. That was fascinating. We do have some questions, and it looks like you're ready for some questions. First of all, how about an answer to Arjan's questions? Do you have some ideas, anyone, of particular native plants in Idaho that would be really dependent on fire refugia to survive? Go ahead. Do you have some? I think any plant that doesn't resprout, so anything that's dependent on seed dispersal would need a place to survive. So most of, well, many native plants would fit in that category.
Yeah.
Including many, probably not the annuals and probably not the ones that are early succession, but I think the ones that are only found in old growth stands would be very dependent on refugia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing I was thinking is sagebrush is probably a good one too. That recovers really slow and is not really adapted to like these large fires that we're seeing now in the rangelands.
Especially large fires that happen. Sagebrush has evolved with fire, depending on which kind of sagebrush you're talking about, but not with the frequency that we're seeing because of the annual grasses.
Yeah.
So, Arjan, there's a couple of questions about locations. Do you think that are refugia typically in particular topographic settings?
Yeah, and I think there's this really cool example of the Steen Mountains. I don't know if you know where that is, but somewhere in, I think, Oregon, which is actually a topographical, like it's a little higher area. And it hasn't burned as frequent as others. Like, so I think that is sort of like a macro fire refugia in the landscape, right? So you know, that hasn't burned as compared to the areas around it. So yeah, definitely topography in like large settings play a role, but also more in smaller settings, like if we have like small riparian areas or lower areas where there's, you know, it's wetter, topography plays a role. And then maybe, I don't know if you remember the photo I showed in the very beginning where we have this rocky cliffs and where we had this trees that were still standing near a rocky cliff. So that could also be a fire break and lead to sort of these patterns of fire refugia too. So definitely a good question, and definitely topography plays a role. Now, we also looked at like persistent fire refugia. So if this was like where we looked at like fire refugia over time, like sort of multiple times that the fire didn't burn. And we found that sometimes topography does have an effect, but sometimes when it doesn't burn one time, it's going to burn extra the next time because the fuels are still there. So yeah, sometimes it's a complicated story.
And there's another question about fire management. It seems like the fire refugia are often seen as places that need to be burned. You know, like everything within this large area should be black. So have the managers been resistant to the idea of the value of refugia?
Yeah, the funny part is like we started really with like sort of firefighters and wanted to get them like on board with the idea of fire refugia. And that was a little bit of a challenge because they really, they value, human lives and buildings. That's sort of like really the first few things they want to, when stuff goes up in fires, that's where they're managing for, and then maybe they're slowly getting into like, okay, if we get everything under control, then a fire refugia map could sort of surface, but we're first going to do all this. So we always had to laugh. We're like, well, the best thing we can do is have like a quick blow up house or something like that in a fire refugia, because then they're going to save it. Yeah, so they're really keyed in on structure and safety, and human lives and property are important. I understand that, but and maybe it's also part of like we need to get our ducks in a row and work with the system they have before they can really like sort of prioritize. Now, if we think about California and the redwoods, when it's like really high value like trees, like I think they'll suppress fire around those kind of things. But where we actually got a lot more like from the managers were like maybe wildlife managers or people who are more like into fuel management, thinking maybe ahead of the fire rather than during a fire, right? So they were thinking, oh, we could do some prescribed burning around these areas, so then when the fire burns, it's not going to burn up this whole like area where we have all our native plants and stuff like that. So I think that's where we got a little bit more traction in working with the managers. It's still, yeah, I mean, I wish we had more resources and more time with the managers to work together. It's a slow process, but yeah, we're getting somewhere slowly.
So Dawn had a question. She said, do areas that are recovering from recent previous fires serve as refugia? They'd have less fuel to burn, but also different vegetation than unburned areas.
So the burned areas might turn into unburned areas in the subsequent fire.
Yes.
Is that that's an interesting concept, because yeah, there is less fuel maybe there. So that's maybe the idea I have with the ephemeral or shifting fire refugia. So I could see that really work in grasslands or rangelands where indeed the fuel is sort of taken away of the landscape, and in a subsequent fire, the areas that actually burned turn into fire refugia. That's an interesting idea. Not something I have really looked at.
It seems though that under climate change, you're predicting, well, a lot of the predictions are that more area is going to burn. What if more area burned under less extreme conditions? It seems like that would increase fire refugia, because if you had more area burning, and much of that area was burning under relatively mild conditions, maybe at the very beginning or the end of a fire season, that would increase the areas unburned or low severity. Wouldn't that be a good thing?
Yeah, maybe. Like so maybe before I answer that exactly question, our hypothesis really came from like managers in the field. They said like, oh, we're seeing fire go where it never would have gone, like in aspens stands, where we got these really dry summers where it dries out, that these kind of wet riparian areas really started burning. Now these were like anecdotal stories maybe, so that's where we sort of based our hypothesis on. Now if we just indeed see an increase in fire activity, fire area, but it doesn't burn under these extreme dry conditions, then yeah, we might get more fire refugia. That's yeah, an interesting idea too. The other thing I'll say is, like, we also, like, sometimes people think like, oh, we are like in favor of no fire or like less amount of fire, but I really like the landscape heterogeneity, where we have high severity fire next to like low severity or no severity fire. So that patchwork is really needed to have even these fire refugia function as they should, in my opinion.
So Sam had a question. Do landscapes with high diversity in topography have higher numbers of refugia? Such as sagebrush regions with lower diversity in topography compared to forested areas?
I think that is true. We had some studies where we looked at, I think Mac Krajcek looked at some sort of topographic complexity, and with more topographic complexity, there is more fire refugia. But this also was related to fire weather, like where the wind was coming from and like how dry it was. And obviously also to vegetation. Now, I don't know if the diversity is necessarily a key indicator, but yeah, like more like riparian areas, like where we have like, aspen don't burn as quick as like, or conifers that are like really fire adapted. So yeah, so I don't know if the diversity, but yeah, if we like maybe go further, so if there's a lot of species diversity in the landscape itself, like patches of different vegetation types, that would increase fire refugia as well, I think.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, Arjan. Hi, Arjan. This is Eva asking a question.
Yep.
So I was just wondering if, is all fire created equal? So is an underburn fire considered the same as a high severity fire that really reduces the amount of propagules and has high mortality for plants, compared to an understory fire that might not really impact the ecosystem very much?
Right, and so that's something we really struggled with. Like from our remote sensing perspective, we kind of wanted it cut and clear and dry, like no burn and burnt. Like, so that's where we draw the line, basically.
Yeah, I can see that.
But in ecological terms, it might actually be beneficial to have that understory burn, right? So even to get that fire refugia, more like, better functioning or whatever, like this, like old growth ponderosa pine stand might need that fire sometimes go through in the understory. So I would say no, not all fire is equal, and it also depends a little bit on, like, what kind of species are you looking at and what is important. But yeah, that's something like our like unburned island database doesn't capture these good understory burns,
Yeah.
which which I would like to, but it's kind of hard to do that with Landsat imagery at this scale. So that's where we need to zoom in and use drones and stuff like that.
Exactly. Well, this is just a great first step towards better understanding of these refugia altogether, and then it can be fine-tuned, of course.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say, what we also thought about, is like this whole idea of the these really high severity fires being refugia itself. Like I don't know if you know about the black-backed woodpecker. That's a species that really needs these like the high severity fire and the snags that are coming from the high severity fire. So you know, in a sense, you could call that also a fire refuge, but an opposite thing. So we struggled with that. Like, should we include that in our paper? And we sort of left that out because it gets a little complicated. But yeah.
Yeah, that's great. It does get interesting for sure when you account for all these natural history traits of all the species involved.
Yeah, yeah, and we were at a fire ecology conference, and I remember there was one senior colleague of us, and he was like, well, fire refugia, that is just not so smart. We need more fire on the landscape, and we need more high severity burns. And we were like, yeah, but we're not advocating for not having high severity burns on the landscape. We want to, you know, look at these fire refugia as part of these high severity burns. So yeah, it was
Yeah,
kind of interesting.
exactly. Just trying to understand what they are, and I think it's a great step towards understanding fire.
One of the things I love about this concept is that fires are patchy. They're patchy at all different scales. We got small patches of unburned, we got large patches of unburned, and they're patchy through time. And just recognizing how important that is a huge contribution. So thank you for that. I hope you've stimulated lots of thinking about the implications for native plants. So thank you, Arjan. Let's all give him a hand.
Thank you. Yep, thanks for inviting me.